In this video I'll be telling you the best stat points guide and how to order them. So without wasting your time, let's begin. Firstly, what even are stat points, you may be asking? Stat points are one of the most crucial and important mechanics in the game, as it increases your damage, health, and stamina. Every time you level up, you get 3 stat points, which you can use to improve one of the 5 stat point sections. Every time you put 1 stat point into melee, all fighting styles do an extra plus 0.5 damage, and you get plus 5 energy. Every time you put 1 stat point into defense, you gain plus 5 health. And every time you put 1 stat point into sword, gun, and blox fruit, they'll deal an extra plus 0.5 damage. Out of the 5 stat sections, you can only max out 3 of them. But you should always max out the defense and melee section, as defense gives you health, and melee gives you stamina, so that'll leave you with 1 more section you can max. Now that you know all about stat points, here's how you should use them based on your situation. Firstly, if you're still grinding levels and aren't max level, you're probably using a fruit as your main damage, unless you're using Buddha. So unless you're using Buddha, your stat points would be what it looks like on the screen. But if your main damage wasn't a fruit, and it was a sword, your stat points would look like this instead. And if your main damage was a gun, your stat points would look like this. Now some of you might be saying, but I use all of my weapons, fruits, gun, and sword, so how do I use my stat points? The last thing you want is your stat points to be mixed up and divided, and looking something like this. So firstly, find which weapon is your main damage, as you might use a gun to group enemies, a sword and fruit for mobility, and use a fighting style for the damage. In this scenario, your main damage is obviously the fighting style, so put stat points into only melee and defense until you change your main damage to a different weapon.
But Brugify, I use all my weapons equally. They are all my main damage.
Well, in this case, you would have to choose your main damage, as having 4 weapons as your main damage is a bad idea. Since you're dividing your stat points on all the sections, each weapon won't reach its full damage potential. So I would recommend just choosing what you want your main damage to be. If you use a gun to just group up enemies, there's no need to put stat points in it. If you use a sword for its mobility and use it for damage every once in a while, there's also no need to have stat points into it. And if you use a fruit just for its Logia effect, or for its transformation, Buddha fruit, there's also no need to have stat points into it. So hopefully that'll help you find out which weapon is your main damage. And if you're grinding levels, I would recommend having your main damage on blox fruits. Now if you're PvPing and don't know what stat points to put, it obviously depends on your combos, and most combo videos provide the stat points too. You can also just think what weapon you are using the most in the combo and what's doing the most amount of damage. If you're using a fruit like ice to stun your enemies, and a gun like soul guitar to life leech enemies when you get low and stun them, there's no need to have stat points into them. And if the sword will be the main damage output, then you should obviously put stat points into sword. Now that's how to order stat points, so let's move on to how to prioritize them. Now that you know all about stat points, here's how you should prioritize when to put stat points into the 3 categories you're using. For the defense category, just put a few stat points into it whenever enemies get you really low, typically every 50 levels or so. For the melee category, if it's your main damage, put all your stat points into here when you level up. Prioritize it the most if it's your main damage. And if it's not your main damage, put stat points into it when you start getting low on stamina often. Once you get a few thousand stamina, you should have enough to never run out, so you should prioritize it the least. And for gun slash sword slash blox fruit, whatever your main damage is, prioritize this the most. Every time you level up, put all stat points into that category, unless you need health slash stamina obviously. This is the prioritization you should follow when using stat points: main damage before defense, and defense before melee. And if your main damage is melee, it's just melee before defense. Now for some fruits like Buddha or Kitsune, prioritize melee over defense, as you won't be getting hit much, so more stamina is better than health. And yeah, that's a complete stat points guide. Anyway guys, that's the end of this video. If you found this video useful, please make sure to like and subscribe. Anyway, bye.